Hi everyone, it would appear I'm coming out of YouTube hibernation to make a response video to Stefan Molyneux and to Inmendham, both I would say arguably polarizing YouTube figures. Stefan Molyneux, probably a lot of you know of him. He's sort of an anarchist, libertarian, Trump supporter, atheist, pseudo-Christian, as of late anyway. And Inmendham is what is known as an ethicist or an antinatalist. And I've watched both of their videos for a while. I hadn't watched Inmendham for quite a while. I'd sort of gone through a phase where I watched his videos, and I think he makes some very valid points. There are a lot of things that I think we really need to consider that he brings up that not a lot of people talk about outside of the antinatalist circles. But he's a grouch, he's a downer, he's down on life, etc., etc. And after a while, you just get full of it. But recently, Stefan Molyneux himself had made a response video to antinatalists, and he talked. I don't think he mentioned Gary Inmendham specifically, but he did make a video talking about antinatalists. And then Gary made a response video to him as well. And to me, this exchange highlighted the problem with discourse. Stefan Molyneux would, I think, bill himself as a guy who is open to all communication, is really open to ideas and bring your argument, et cetera, et cetera. But he is really combative when it comes to a lot of these discussions. And what you could see in his video about antinatalism is a complete mischaracterization of the position itself. And then Gary made a response video, and he characterizes Stefan Molyneux, I think, in some very unfair ways. So what you have is a lot of people just talking past each other. Nobody's really understanding. Nobody's taken the honest time to really understand their opponent's position in a really open and honest, careful way. Do the thought experiment. Immerse yourself in that thought, in that mindset. Because often the charge that's made is someone is either completely immoral, like to the point of being evil, or they're just so stupid as to be immediately discreditable. But those things aren't often the case. A lot of times, I've found, even the guys in this world that I consider to be, the smartest guy in the room, that includes a lot of women, of course, they're very intelligent. I would say, add to this list, just pulling someone from the top of my head, Ben Shapiro. But Ben Shapiro's got a lot of very serious blind spots. And he's obviously an intelligent guy. If you gave him an IQ test, I don't know what his IQ is, but I guarantee you it would be quite high. But he's got some blind spots, and we all do. We all have our biases that are built into us. And it's only a careful introspection and a lot of hot tub deliberations at night where we can start to peel away some of our own biases and some of our own blind spots. But to just reject someone, Ben Shapiro or Molyneux or Inmendham, as being unintelligent or evil, I think is to miss the point. Generally what we have here is misunderstanding. And that can be a lack of understanding on your part of their position, or it can be a lack of understanding on their part of either your position or the nature of our reality, etc., etc. And you can tell this because one of the main charges that Molyneux made in his antinatalist video was that they are nihilistic. And if you listen to antinatalists, they are the complete opposite of nihilists. They believe that there is incredible amounts of meaning, in particular in human suffering, and the suffering of all creatures, all sentient life, and that the mitigation of that suffering ought be our primary concern, even if it is to the point where we believe that new forms of sentient life ought not be brought into the world, because the baseline of human and all sentient experience is suffering. And so do we have the right to continue to promote and propagate this suffering? So it's not a nihilistic position. And of course, again, Gary made some comments back to Molyneux that were less than charitable, etc., etc. He doesn't like libertarians and anarchists, so he likes to liken them to, just promoting the domination of the wealthy and that sort of thing. But what I wanted to respond to actually more specifically today is Gary's recent video where he talks about some videos he's made about free will and determinism. And he is a person who believes that there's no such thing as free will, that that our appearance of choice is really just the combination of our nature as a person, our personality, our nature, and all the experiences that have led up to our current position, and all the information that we have available to us in our conscious brain, or even subconscious brain, actually, because they've done these scientific studies where when you think you've made a choice, they can actually tell that your brain had made the decision before you consciously become aware of your quote-unquote choice. And, you might call this, we could call this the D factor, the deterministic factor. Your character, whether that, and that's probably even formed somewhat by your genetics to some degree, your ability to process information, your IQ, all of the experiences you've had over your lifetime up to the point in which you are making, again, the quote-unquote decision, and all the information you have available to you, then forms a deterministic response. In other words, there could be no other response in that moment. Given all of that D factor, you would only make a certain choice. You would only make a certain decision. And that's his belief. He doesn't believe there's any such thing as free will. And so the issue that I have with that, of course, is that I think Gary boxes himself in by his own worldview, but he doesn't want to be boxed in by that. He wants to make moral judgments on people. He wants to call people assholes. He's very confused and frustrated. He's quite frustrated by the fact that people respond to his deterministic view of the world by saying, well, then what does anything matter? Then it doesn't matter what I do. And he can't understand why people would actually develop maybe a little bit of a nihilistic response to the notion that everything is deterministic. And he's very frustrated by that. And he says, well, no, it all matters. In fact, it matters more. Once you understand that we are, that these are all just mechanical processes, and that everything that you think is a choice is actually just the culmination of all the mechanical processes up until this point, including your nature, who you kind of are, which is, again, a combination of all the experiences you've had, your personality, your genetics, whatever, that it matters more that we spread, say, for instance, the idea of antinatalism, human suffering, the suffering of all sentient life, that these things matter even more. That, again, it's the opposite of a nihilistic position. It's the ultimate caring for what is the baseline of sentient experience, which is suffering. Everything is trying to get away from suffering. We're always trying to move away from suffering. But we don't just have this baseline where we're just in bliss, where we're just in pleasure. But he's frustrated. He's frustrated that people can't get it. And the interesting thing is, the only thing you can do, if that is your worldview, if you really truly believe that everything is a set of material processes, all you can do is appeal to people. You can only add to the D factor to sway it to the way you'd like to see things go. You can only add to the information pile. What you can't do, I don't think, based on that worldview, is make moral judgments on people's character. Because if it is deterministic, then they can only act on the D factor that is where they're at that moment. And even if you add more information and you say suffering and you show videos and you just do everything you can, you make rational arguments to the person, if they don't come around to see things your way, you got to be okay with that, because that is their D factor. To do anything else is to ask them to make a fucking choice, which is interesting because he talked about in his video that I'm responding to here, Gary, hi Gary, talked about, if people want the freedom from being a sack of shit, if you just make bad choices and you don't acknowledge the suffering of sentient life and you just go through life being an asshole, and you want the freedom from that, well, the thing to do is to not be an asshole and to use your brain and you've got resources available, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, are you asking them to make a choice? See, I think based on the materialistic, deterministic view of the world, I think you can make moral judgments on actions. I think you can say that's an immoral thing to do. And here's how I rationalize that statement. But what I don't think you can do is call someone immoral. Because again, how else could they respond in that moment if they are a complete end result of a whole bunch of mechanical processes, again, and their D factor is what determines their choice before they ever consciously think they've made a choice, then they're not making a choice. And morality is about making choices, right? That's what ethics is all about. Option A, option B, right? And if you can't make a choice, you can't be moral. you can act morally, you can act within the moral framework, once we can rationalize, once we have the powers of observation and rationality and logic, etc., and sentience, and compassion and empathy and all that, we can determine what are the ethical things to do. But I don't think we can make a moral judgment on a person for not choosing to act morally. All you could do, Gary, would be to appeal to them as much as possible to try to add to their D factor, the deterministic factor, which would hopefully at some point sway them to move in that direction. But what are you going to do then? Call them Mother Teresa? I know that's probably not the best example to use, but are you going to say, oh, you're no longer an asshole, you're a wonderful person? Well, how do you make that judgment if everything is deterministic? And that's the biggest pet peeve I have with Gary, aside from the fact that he seems to be a very unhappy guy, and that's unfortunate. I think even if you come to a determination that the world, the nature of our existence is deterministic, I think it still behooves you to say, okay, well, what can I do to maximize pleasure, minimize suffering, both in myself, which is my primary responsibility, and in those around me, and then act accordingly. But to be, sort of miserable all the time does lend itself also, I would say, to people saying, well, if you think that, everything is so bad, why don't you just kill yourself? Which is a knee-jerk response to antinatalism. And I will admit that when I first saw Gary's videos, probably 6 or 7 years ago now, that was my knee-jerk response too. And it's a weak one. It's an intellectually weak response. Probably some of you had that response at the beginning of this video when if you hadn't heard of Inmendham and antinatalism yourself before. And it's an intellectually weak response, and it is a response that Stefan Molyneux himself had on his recent antinatalism video. To say to an antinatalist, well, if it's so bad, why don't you just kill yourself, is to completely misunderstand the entire premise of antinatalism itself. To remove one person from the pool of sentient life, the trillions and quadrillions and immeasurable amount of suffering creatures that have ever existed and that ever will exist, is just so futile, and it's just so ridiculous. It's a complete misunderstanding, again, of the whole concept of antinatalism. It's intellectually weak, and but you don't help yourself, Gary, when you run around calling everybody assholes, and when you talk about, you just say over and over, life sucks, life is shit, life is garbage. Make the case intellectually, but don't be surprised when people either respond with nihilistic conclusions based on that, or basically tell you to go kill yourself, because that's what you're going to get. I think you're boxed in by your own deterministic worldview, and I don't buy it myself. I think we do have choice, and I don't think there's any way to probably completely prove or disprove either theory, but you have to have consistency with whichever theory you believe is your worldview, is the nature of our reality. And so to make moral judgments of people rather than people's actions, I think, is not being consistent with a deterministic worldview. And I think to do anything other than to try to add information to people's palate so that their D factor, hopefully you can reach a point of equilibrium or hit the teeter-totter going in the other direction, I think that's all you can do. I don't think that you can get angry at people, get frustrated with people, because to do so is to deny the deterministic worldview that you claim is the accurate representation of the nature of our existence. So all I'm saying here is be consistent with your own worldview at least, and recognize that, and maybe that'll give you some peace. Maybe you can calm down and stop calling people assholes quite so much, because there can be no assholes in a deterministic worldview. There can only be people who are, by their programming, doing what they're doing. And you're hoping to change their programming by adding information. That's a good idea. Maybe if enough additional programming happened to Hitler, things would have been different. But as it is, according to your worldview, Hitler could only have done what he did based on his D factor at the time. I don't know if you can even call him an asshole at that point. What he did was assholish, for sure. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think.